So the next thing we're going to look at is two poems that discuss similar questions about what life is, what we can know about life, but from a slightly different perspective, from poetry, rather than obviously Bede's story is, it's a beautiful little moment, but it is part of a debate in his history. It's trying to make a point, and these poems are perhaps a bit more reflective. So this is Maxims II, and it survives in one manuscript, in an 11th century manuscript, but it could well be several centuries older than that. And it's a poem about the nature of the world. It's a collection of maxims and statements, semi-proverbial statements, descriptions of the natural world, descriptions of human society, all put together and listed, in a sense, or kind of collected as a poem, following the rules of Anglo-Saxon poetry, but without much in the way of explanation for why you would put all those things together. And it's a form of poem that we would not think of as poetry, really, but there are quite a number of poems like this. I'll read this as the beginning of it. I'll just read it. Cyning shall richa healdan. Ceastra beoð feorran gesyne, orðanc enta geweorc, þysse eorðan syndan, wrætlic, weallstana geweorc. Wyrd byth on lyfte swiftust, þunar byth þragum hludast, þrymmas syndan Cristes myccle. Wyrd byth swiðost, winter byth cealdost, lencten hrimigost, he byth lengist cald. Summa sunlíkost, swiðl byth hatost, harvest hrimigost, heildan bringeth years westmas, þysse geweorc sendeth. Soth byth swiðost, sink byth eorðan, gold gumana jocham and golmul snotterost. Fien yerum fraud, þysse feila jebideth. We byth wundrum clibor, vulknu shriveth. So a king should defend a kingdom. Cities are seen from afar, the ancient work of giants which are on this earth, wondrous work of wall stones. The wind in the sky is swiftest, thunder is loudest in season. Great are the powers of Christ. Fate is the most powerful thing. Winter is coldest, spring frostiest, it is the longest cold. Summer, sun brightest, the sun is hottest. Harvest most glory blessed, it brings to men the year's fruits, which God sends them. Truth is most treacherous, treasure is dearest. Gold to every man, and an old man is most wise, made wise with years gone by, he who has experienced much. Sorrow is wondrously clinging, clouds glide on. And it goes on after that point to kind of to list a lot more statements about the world, but this kind of gives you a sense of it. I mean, this is quite strange, isn't it, as a poem? This is not really what we would think of as poetry. It's a combination of description of things as they are, but also probably things as they should be or as they could be. So that first statement there, the very first line of the poem, Cyning shall richa healdan, a king should defend a kingdom. So it's just describing what the duty of a king is. So it's interesting. It shows us a view of what a king should do, but it's also it's a fairly obvious statement, really. There's not much depth there necessarily. And then you get this very poetic description of cities. Can you see what the word is for cities in that first line? Kestra. Well, Ceastra. Do you recognise that as a word that we like? Chester, yeah. So like yeah, it's what the Anglo-Saxons called the remains of Roman cities that they found. And so, yeah, so lots of place names have Chester as a second element. Winchester, Dorchester, Chichester, yeah, there's a lot. And it's from the Latin castro, I think, isn't it?
And Manchester.
Manchester, yep. Yeah, so, I mean, when the Anglo-Saxons came and settled in England, of course, there were quite a lot of standing Roman remains. The Romans built on a big scale in stone, didn't they? And they would have kind of fortifications and Roman buildings. And the Anglo-Saxons didn't necessarily know who had built these things or when they'd been built or anything like that. So in poetry, they're quite often described as the work of giants. Of ents is the word there, orðanc enta geweorc. Yeah, and that's where Tolkien got his ents from. So whether they really thought that giants had built these, or if it's just a way of thinking about, past civilizations, we don't know who they were or when they lived, but they've left us these huge, beautiful, monumental remains. and so we can talk about them as if they were giants. So there's a kind of a mystery about the landscape that they're inhabiting. So, that's a kind of a nice little poetic description of cities. But then you move on to the natural world. So the wind in the sky is swiftest, thunder is loudest in season. That's a kind of very, very obvious statement, really. There's lots of powerful things here. So the wind is powerful, thunder is powerful and loud, and then great are the powers of Christ. So another kind of power. So the poem doesn't kind of tell us what the relationship is between those statements, between those powers, but we can sort of speculate or think about it for ourselves. What is it? Is the power of the wind, is that Christ's power, or should we be thinking about it as Christ's power is greater than the wind and all natural powers? It might be relevant that the word for thunder is þunar. The Old English version of Thor is þunar. In Norse mythology, certainly Thor is very closely associated with the powers of the sky, thunder and lightning and storms and so on. So this is probably just the word thunder, but there might be a kind of sense there of other kinds of powers, outside Christ's. So there's all these kind of powerful things that are sort of, a mystery. And then Wyrd, fate, is the most powerful thing. So Wyrd is a word, it's a very distinctive Old English word that comes up a lot in poetry, talking about fate and fortune. And it does seem to mean fate, but it also, it's not necessarily a personified power. It might just mean things that happen, or the course of events, or something like that. It's a noun formed from the verb meaning to happen. So it's kind of like happenings, things that happen. So it's not necessarily fortune with her wheel or whatever. It could just be the course of events in time and things that happen. But that's the most powerful thing. And then we get a list of the seasons. We get the name of the season and then a superlative that describes it. So winter is the coldest, spring is the frostiest. You see lencten, Lent is the name for spring. It's the longest cold. I like that, the observation that although winter is coldest, often in spring it's cold for a really long time. Just when you think it's going to start to get warmer, it stays cold. Summer, sun brightest, when the sun is hottest. And then harvest, which is their name for autumn, is blessed with glory, because that's when you get the fruits of the year, year's Westmas, which God sends. So
it's faintly reminiscent, or rather Eliot's colours is coming through here, isn't it? I wonder whether he read this poem, because isn't it in the Wastelands he wrote April is cruelest month?
Yeah, I think that's possible actually. I think he did read Old English poetry. It's interesting, because it does illustrate that actually that kind of statement, it can still be part of poetry, can't it? It's still something that people will write in poems and read in poems, this way of kind of characterising the seasons. Even though here it might seem very obvious, it's still something worth saying, isn't it, in a poem? Yeah. So why might these things be worth saying through in the context of all these greater natural powers? And then again we see men are mentioned here in the harvest brings to men the year's fruits. So they're receiving from nature, but they're not in control of it really, are they? They're receiving them from God.
There's something about like the effect of a litany. It's like the making of the statement, locating you in terms of experience in where you are in the world.
I often think about it, and I think about mindfulness. Okay, so the idea that you're observing without making a judgment. And there is a lot of that here. That is just saying what the thing is, and it's not. You can't dispute the idea. Winter is the coldest season. Yes, of course it is. But you're observing that. You're seeing it. You're perhaps seeing what your relationship might be to it, or human relationship. But really it's about kind of appreciating things as they are without worrying about changing them. And so that might be one way of thinking about it.
And you realise that's what poetry does.
Yeah. And then finally we get, so truth, this is a bit more complicated. Truth is most treacherous. Treasure is dearest, gold to every man, and an old man is most wise, made wise with years gone by, he who has experienced much. How can truth be most treacherous?
What's the etymology of treacherous?
The way you translate it is a bit difficult. So the word is swiðost, but it does mean something tricky or slippery, or not necessarily not to be relied upon, but not something you completely can control or understand. There is a kind of negative overtone. I mean, this word is used for traitors, human traitors, and for people who are not trustworthy. So there is a sort of a negative overtone. I do think this is a very puzzling statement. It can be hard to work out what the truth is, even if you know there should be a truth. It's not necessarily something you can grasp or get hold of. That's very interesting, especially in the context of this poem, which is stating lots of things which are true and sort of beyond argument, like winter is the coldest season. That seems like it's a truth that you couldn't call treacherous. You think that's the kind of thing you couldn't argue with. And then treasure is dearest, gold to every man. Well, I'm not going to argue with that one. And an old man is most wise, made wise with the years gone by, he who has experienced much. It's nice that you've got this idea of somebody growing wise as the years pass. And you see the word is feorran, which is like the course of the years. And we've just heard about the course of 1 year, haven't we, from winter to spring to summer. So the old person is someone who's experienced lots of this cycle of the year going past, experienced many things. And somehow this has produced wisdom. And I think this idea of wisdom as something which comes with age is, obviously a universal idea, but it's something which the Anglo-Saxons valued very highly. And then this last line, which is just brilliant. Sorrow is wondrously clinging. The word is clibor, which is just really kind of onomatopoeic. It means sort of sticky, something that, really adhesive and sticky. And then the clouds glide on. So what's the sort of the purpose of that line in this one? You've got that juxtaposition there between the person who's experienced a lot of things and then sorrow is wondrously clinging. Well, one of the things you're going to experience if you're a person who's lived a long time is you're going to experience a lot of sorrow and it will stick with you. But nonetheless, time passes and perhaps that's how you become wise. You're made wise with years gone by. So it might be interesting to compare that proverb about you can't appreciate sweetness unless you don't know pleasure of sweetness unless you experience bitterness. So yeah, that's how you become wise, through experiencing bitterness and sorrow, but time passes on. So this talks about these kind of questions in a very impersonal way, doesn't it? It doesn't. There is no kind of voice here. It's the absolutely impersonal voice of a poet just telling you these things and not making an argument, not kind of trying to explain, just saying this is how things are. But the next poem comes at some of the same kind of questions from a much more personal perspective. And this is one of the group of poems which is often known as the Old English elegies. And this one is called The Wanderer. It comes from a 10th century manuscript which contains poems on all kinds of subjects. And they're all in this great book called the Exeter Book, which belongs to Exeter Cathedral and has done since the 11th century, and it's still there. But it's kind of an anthology of poems on all kinds of subjects, and several of them have somebody speaking about their own experience. So an anonymous, nameless person saying, this is what I've experienced and this is how I feel, this is what I think. And this one is The Wanderer. And I've only given you about the last third or so of the poem. The beginning of it, he talks about his situation, he talks about what's happened to him. He describes himself. He's somebody who's lost his home, he's lost his family and his lord and his companions, and so he becomes an eorðstana, which means an earth walker, somebody who, you see the word earth, and then stepper is like stepper, person who steps, so a wanderer is what we call an exile, and he's homeless. And he describes how his lord, who was his protector and his best friend, has died, and so he's had to bury him and just go wandering around the earth. He would originally have lived in a hall, probably, much like the one described in Bede's story. He would have been part of that kind of society of warriors living in a hall together, led by a lord, and now he's lost all of that and he's completely alone. And then he reflects on that experience. I'll read it in translation first. And so I cannot think for the world why my spirit does not grow dark when I consider all the life of men, how they suddenly left the hall, brave young warriors. So this earth every day declines and decays, and so a man cannot grow wise before he has had his share of winters in this world. A wise man should be patient, not too hot-hearted, nor too hasty with words, not too weak a warrior, nor too reckless, not too fearful, nor too optimistic, nor too greedy for riches, nor ever too eager to boast before he knows for sure. So we've got at this point some advice about how a warrior should behave, very much in the form of the proverb that we saw earlier, and in fact it almost is very, very similar. If you look at the line that's not too fearful, nor too optimistic, you can see ne too forch, ne too fain, which we saw earlier, about not being too soon fearful or too soon joyful. And again, this is about advice for wise conduct. It's about striking the balance, isn't it? So not being too weak as a warrior, but not being too reckless either. So striking the balance between being a coward and being overconfident. And again, advice about being patient, about being not too hot-hearted. It's a great word. Hat-haired is the word there. And not too hasty with your words, and not boasting too early, before you know what you can actually achieve. The wise hero must perceive how terrible it will be when all this world's wealth lies waste, as now in various places throughout this earth walls stand blown by the wind, covered with frost, the buildings snow-swept. He who thought wisely on this foundation and deeply considers this dark life, wise in spirit, remembers often from afar much slaughter, and speaks these words. Where is the horse? Where is the young warrior? Where is the treasure giver? Where are the seats of feasting? Where are the joys of the hall? Alas, the bright cup! Alas, the mailed warrior! Alas, the glory of the prince! How that time has passed away, grown dark under the cover of night as if it had never been. There stands now in the tracks of the dear troop a wall wondrously high, decorated with serpents. The warriors were taken away by the power of spears, weapons greedy for slaughter. Fate the famous, and there's Wyrd again, you see, Wyrd Seomera. And storms batter those rocky cliffs, snow falling fetters the earth, the tumult of winter. More winter, more winter. Then dark comes, night shadows deepen. From the north comes a fierce hailstorm, hostile to men. All is full of hardship in this earthly realm. The course of events changes the world under the heavens. Here wealth is fleeting, here friend is fleeting, here man is fleeting, here kinsman is fleeting. All the foundation of this world turns to waste. So spoke the wise man in his mind, where he sat alone in thought. It will be well for the one who seeks mercy, comfort from the Father in heaven, where for us all stability stands. There's quite an interesting word at the end there, quite unusual in Old English. Festnung is the word for a thing that's fast, like a fastness, and that's the word for stability. And there's a very characteristic in that passage, which is here everything is fleeting, wealth is fleeting, and so hebith feorran, hebith friendlena, hebith mornlena, hebith maylena. And the word lena is related to the word loan, so it's actually describing things which are on loan. So it's not something you possess and can hold on to, but just something which is lent to you and can be taken away again. So, I mean, this is a very melancholy, a kind of sad view of the world. But, I mean, can you see similarities perhaps with the text that we've already looked at with the bead and the...
It's very wintry, isn't it?
It is very wintry. He describes himself with this amazing word. It was only found once in Old English, but he says he himself is winter carey, as sorrowful as winter. This is like care, you see. And he does say, in fact, that although he's describing this dark view of life, actually, I cannot think why my spirit does not grow dark. Actually, it hasn't grown dark. There's something still kind of that he's holding on to. And he describes his, the beauties of heroic society, the young warrior and the feasting and the hall and all of that, the bright cup. All of those things are beautiful, and he can still kind of see the beauty in them, even though they are gone. And yeah, there's this great phrase that a man cannot grow wise before he's had his share of winters in the world, wintredale. So, we've seen all the things that winter can represent, the experience and suffering and sorrow, and all of those things eventually will help you to grow wise. But it's very practical wisdom. It's meant to give you some comfort, I think. It's not, it's reflective and it's thoughtful, but actually it's supposed to be kind of supportive. It's supposed to help you. I think it's not despairing.